and welcome to this episode of InConversation. Today, we have with us Mr. Abheek Barua, the Chief Economist of HDFC Bank. Abheek is a distinguished double MA, one from the Delhi School of Economics and the second one from the University of Maryland in the United States. Abheek has about 3 decades of work experience, and apart from doing his job in the bank, Abheek actually finds the time and energy to write novels. And yeah, they have nothing to do with economics. Welcome to the show, Abheek. What do economists actually do? In very simple language.
And I've often wondered myself what exactly it is that economists do. But on a more serious note, the first thing to recognize is the fact that what an economist does specifically depends on where he is working. For instance, an economist at the World Bank would be looking at issues like poverty, sanitation, and so forth, would be doing something radically different from an economist who, say, working at the RBI and looking at monetary policy. But let me talk about what I do and have done in the financial sector and banking for almost 30 years now. As you would sort of appreciate, banking is what we call a play on the economy. Virtually everything that banking is about has a connect with the underlying economy. First, advise internal clients of the bank, particularly senior management, but also some of the business people on where some of the key variables that their day-to-day existence sort of revolves around, like credit and deposit growth, how they're likely to move. Number two is advising external clients on things like exchange rate movements, interest rate movements, and so forth. And thirdly, interpreting government and RBI policy for the key decision makers within the bank.
How much of economics is art and how much of it is science? Is it more art or is it more science?
Ravindran, I think it's a bit of both. So if by science you mean systematic analysis of data, of trying to predict events and changes on the basis of analytical models, yes, there is a lot of that involved. But beyond that, I think there is a lot of intuition. There is a lot of exercise of experience that is involved in ultimately gauging what will happen to some of the key economic parameters or variables that I mentioned, and that you could sort of describe as an art. Often it becomes a bit of an occult art because you use all kinds of very strange techniques or thought processes to arrive at a conclusion which might not seem entirely, logical and rational and, theoretically tight as people would perceive it to be.
In the post-pandemic world, people are extremely worried about how safe are their jobs, how safe is their income. How do you think the Indian economy is going to fare going forward? 3 months, 6 months, 1 year?
What we see today is that things are not as bad as we had predicted then. And certainly the kind of job losses or salary reductions that we had anticipated and taken decisions on that basis have not panned out. That said, I certainly wouldn't want to play this down because there are pockets of the economy, maybe not just pockets, but swathes of the economy that have been that are outside really the catchment of this formal white collar segment that are hurting and will continue to hurt. clearly, there are some sectors which are very, very closely dependent on their existence and business on physical contact, hospitality, civil aviation. I hear education also has been very, very severely impacted on by the pandemic, and it will sort of take a while for them to recover. We are not entirely sure of how the informal sector, particularly the SMEs in the manufacturing space and informal services are doing, but I suspect there are problems there. My sense is that uh, this will be over sooner than a lot of people anticipate or had anticipated in the past. So when the pandemic hit us, we were sort of prepared for a long, deep depression. I think it's going to be more sort of a deep decline, but a reasonably sharp recovery from those levels, given that the pandemic is brought under control, a vaccine is introduced and rolled out with some degree of success. But by soon, I certainly don't mean next month or the next week. I think we'll have to wait for about 8 months to a year for any degree of normalcy to return.
Which sector or sectors would be the key drivers of the Indian economy that will again put everything back on track?
Very good question, Sanjay. And I'm going to use a combination of science, art, and the occult to predict this. There have been some sort of surprise sectors, automobiles, for instance, that seem to be doing very well. And from whatever anecdotal evidence that we have on this, this is likely to sustain. And initially, the bounce was really in small size cars, but it's now spreading to the more the bigger sedans and so forth. What is encouraging is that smaller trucks, the LCVs, have also made a bit of a comeback. Construction equipment, which is often clubbed with trucks and LCV and commercial vehicles, those are doing well, which seems to suggest there is a pickup in infrastructure related investment activity. And then there are sort of the no-brainers. Pharmaceuticals in this kind of pandemic, you would expect pharmaceuticals to do well. I think that will sort of drive the engine forward. Then, of course, there is this FMCG pack, which is relatively insulated from the business cycle, which has been doing quite well. Again, there are a couple of surprise sectors. Commodities, steel, aluminum, for instance, seem to be doing well. Part of it is related, of course, to this bounce in the auto sector. The cars, of course, need inputs of flat steel, aluminum, and so forth. And again, with infrastructure activity picking up, driven largely by government effort, that's also sort of creating a demand for steel. Of course, that's a long-term, a slightly, I would say long-term, a medium-term story, which is a little different, where there are questions about whether there would be more diversification of supply and sourcing from China, and whether we can get a piece of the action. And this is because of both the pandemic, which has sort of exposed the risk of depending too much on one single economy, and also because of simmering political tensions between China and the US, and whether we can sort of get a piece of the action as an alternative supply base, got investments in areas like telecom handsets, electronics, and so forth. So diversification away from China would be a significant benefit from us. And my sense is that in a number of sectors, we are prepared to facilitate this diversification and switch to alternative sourcing.
I'm specifically referring to your novel, The City of Death, which is actually a crime thriller. How did that come about?
Let me make some confessions here. One, I am completely addicted to crime television serials on Netflix and all the other streaming channels that you have. So I spend a lot of my time, watching crime thrillers, and I also I'm a voracious reader. So I just it was done basically as what you would call a lark. I wanted to see if my abilities to write, which I usually deploy to write on where interest rates are headed, could be better deployed or deployed in a more engaging manner in trying to sort of piece together a crime thriller. And I was very inspired by some of the television stuff that I had been watching. But I was kind of consumed by the process of writing and the book and the story. So that sort of drove me on. And I found a balance between the two competing demands on my time. But for anyone who wants to sort of experiment with this, let me tell you that it is indeed very challenging and very taxing on both your sort of body and soul. So caveat, potential writer, it's not as easy as you think. But once you sort of get to the end of your novel or your story or whatever you've written, the high that you get, the satisfaction that you get, is unmatched by and will remain unmatched by anything like the size of your bonus or what you or a newspaper article on interest rates. It's for people who are interested in reading and sort of the creative arts. Coming out with a final creative product, I think, is a hugely satisfying experience, and I'm glad I did it.
You just heard him, Abheek Barua. He's soft spoken, he's urbane, he's sophisticated, and yes, he's an economist. And more than that, he loves to watch crime shows and write crime fiction. It has been a real pleasure having you with us, Abheek.